I'm here today actually with my colleague who's just over there, Michael Thorley. So I'm going to be doing some input on this whole subject, and then Michael will join me on the stage for some final Q&A. So as I said, I'm really delighted to be here. I think my primary purpose, certainly in my professional life, has been to study the whole question of change and transition and movement. And in particular, what can leaders do to enable transition and movement and change in ways that is more effortless. So change is never effort-free, right? It's hard work, but it can be done in ways that is more easy for yourself, more sustainable, and less depleting in terms of energy and resources. So I'm delighted to be here. I was very inspired by hearing Sir Bruce talk this morning as well. There were two particular comments that he made that I registered. One was how leadership is everybody. It's not just the hierarchy or the pyramid. We can all be leaders. That was something that very much resonated with me. It is a collective act. And secondly, he talked about the trend of localism now, whether that's in our geopolitical arena or indeed how institutions get run. So many times today I've been in various sessions and heard about co-creating with the patient, patients as leaders through social media. Everything now is driven more by local rather than the hierarchy. So the question is, how do you lead change in a world of collapsing hierarchies? So I'm going to be sharing my thoughts about that with you today. So I've called this speech The Power of Presence. And it was almost nearly, actually, the power of absence. It was a bit touch and go for me personally. Here, literally 24 hours ago, I was at the Great Western Hospital in Swindon. I don't know if some of you might have been through there or know of it. So here was me leaving the hospital last night. And last Friday night, my father was involved in an extremely serious car accident. An 88-year-old man who he was driving, and he had this accident at 50 miles an hour. He was rushed to this particular hospital. I wasn't in the country, so that was a bit stressful for me. And for the last few days, I've been a bit touch and go. And I actually emailed Peter and Kirsten saying, I think I'm going to come, but I'm not quite sure what's actually going to be happening at the moment. The good news is I've just heard that he's out now of the hospital. He had a CT scan last night on his chest. But I just wanted to talk about from the paramedics who arrived at the scene through to primary care. He lives in Hungerford, so I met his local GP on Monday. I've been with him solidly for the last 3 days. And with the doctors in Swindon last night and how they examined him. The presence of your profession is extraordinary, and how that helped my dad, how that helped me come to terms with his injury. And I just want to thank you, for what you do. But the initial reason I was going to call this The Power of Presence was I was listening to the radio about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and there was somebody talking about how to lead in professions where you are with pain and suffering. So what does pain and suffering require of us? What does it require of you, in your medical profession? And this person on the radio, and I knew I was doing this talk, so I tuned in a bit more than maybe I usually do. And this person said that pain or suffering requires, number one, an explanation. What's wrong? Diagnosis. And it also requires a solution. Get me better, please. What do I actually have to do? And then this person went on to say that pain is a mystery that demands a presence. Pain is also a mystery that demands a presence. And I was very, very touched by that sentence, that it is partly about expertise, of diagnosis and solution. But the healing power of presence cannot be underestimated. Cannot be underestimated. So, of course, your empathy with patients like my dad is extraordinary. But how can you also bring, as doctors, I guess, the wise and compassionate doctor to your leadership? Because leadership, particularly, sometimes the more senior you actually get, your task in leadership is to work on the system that produces the outcomes. You're not always in direct contact with the outcomes itself. Your role is to create this flourishing human system, whether that's in a hospital or a practice, wherever it is you actually exercise your leadership. Your task is to work on the system that produces those particular outcomes. So what I like to say that in those situations, very often it's important to put your knowledge to the background, all of your expertise, and I know this, and I'm an authority on that, and your presence to the foreground. So leadership is about putting your knowledge to the background and your presence to the foreground. Because if all you do is lead through your knowledge and expertise, you create dependency on yourself. Whereas the power of your presence can be totally inspiring for your teams and the people around you as well. So my nephew was actually with me yesterday, and my dad's grandson. And Martin Rowland, he's a senior staff nurse, actually, at Cardiff General Hospital in the A&E department. So I was with Martin yesterday, and he was, obviously anxious about his granddad as well. I said, so Martin, I'm doing this speech tomorrow about leadership in healthcare. So from, your perspective, he's 26. When you are with the medical profession and they are at their best, what's present? What's actually there? And he thought for a little while, then he said to me yesterday, he said, calm and low ego. I quite like that. So I wanted to pass that on, the knowledge from my nephew, who's also a nurse. But the presence of calmness and low ego, he said, for him anyway, in his role, that's actually very, very helpful. So the main message I want to get over today in terms of this whole notion of presence is that your ability to tune into and regulate your own inner mental and emotional response to experience allows you then to tune into and move the system around you. But it does fundamentally start with yourself, your inner game of leadership. Can you be aware and tune into and regulate your own emotional and mental response to experience? That's what I mean by the power of presence. So where does it start? Well, as Peter said, it starts in self-awareness. Because to be able to tune into yourself and to regulate your response to experience, which has such a fundamental impact on other people around you, you have to know your pre-programming. So the question that Michael and I often use when we're coaching or working with leaders is, how was your leadership formed? And by that, I don't mean what training programs have you been on, but fundamentally, what is your default? What is your habitual response as a leader, particularly under stress, where often, our true selves really come out? So I just want to share briefly, a bit about myself. As Peter said, I've had leadership roles as well in large, complex corporations. Maybe not as complex as what Bruce outlined this morning. So I am an adopted child. You can say that my life began in change, actually, when I was given up for adoption at 6 weeks old. Maybe that's why I'm in the field of change. I had a fundamental transition and change at the very start of my life. Now, there might be some adopted parents or children here. We're all different. But for me, my habitual response to experience as an adopted child, I always have two key questions on my mind, which can spill out into my leadership. The first one is, it's very, very fundamental, am I lovable? How can somebody give a child away? Am I really lovable? The second one is, am I good enough? Maybe I just wasn't good enough, and that's why this happened to me in life. So those two questions about, am I lovable and am I good enough, fuels two things for me as a leader. Number one is pleasing. I like to please people because of the fear of being abandoned or people not liking me. So that is often a trigger, in my own leadership is pleasing. And I think we all know as leaders, you can't please everybody, can you? The second response is one of perfection. So am I good enough? So I will tend to want to be over-perfect in what I actually do. And sometimes neither of these, the desire to please and to be perfect can actually serve me when I've been leading big complex change, but they can also get in the way as well. But understanding my triggers and how they were formed enables me to tune into and to acknowledge what is my stuff in this particular situation, and how can I sort of clean that up a bit. So I always believe that my adoption story is a huge asset. So here's me, I think probably around 3 or 4. So I never quite felt I was in a certain family or out of family. So I tend to like to live my life and my leadership a bit on the edge of things, you know, because can I really trust and join this family? What will happen to me again? So I grew up in a way that was quite detached, and I just think this photo of me summarizes that up a bit. And at the same time, I was intensely curious. By the way, that is my dad standing behind me, if you're wanting to see my dad standing behind me. So this combination, I think, of detached curiosity enables me to do change, I think, pretty well, because the more you get over-identified sometimes with the system, if you're not, you know, detached enough, you can actually do, you know, sometimes things that aren't quite that functional. So this combination of being detached, and I was intensely curious as an adopted child, how do people form families and systems? I'm always looking at physical characteristics. It actually got me into the field of anthropology, so my actual academic training is in anthropology. I think detached curiosity is quite helpful for that as well. So, you know, how was your leadership formed? What might be the 2 words that summarize, you know, your story and how that now gets played out in your leadership? And the reason why it's important to do this, because if you are not conscious, you repeat your story. If you're not aware of your story, you're probably likely to be repeating it all the time in your leadership. And I do love this little cartoon here. And I'm sure, you know, in your leadership here, whether it's in the NHS or in the army, I've seen a wonderful array of different medical professions here at this conference, is this classic firefighting, you know? So there's a problem, we come in, we try to firefight, and boof, the same thing keeps repeating itself. And it's the difference between what I call action and movement. Too much change is about action, just getting busy trying to solve things, rather than getting to the underlying source of the routines. So if you notice these firefighters, they're probably looking at this lady here who keeps her behavior, keeps on, you know, getting into problems. And they might be saying, gosh, you know, she can't jump out of buildings very well, or let's send her on a training program to understand how to jump out. But what they're not looking at is what they're holding. The source, I think somebody on that video just now, which was wonderful, said, get to know the problem, what is the source of the problem, and go there. So it's important self-awareness. It does start with the self, and what are the structures that you're holding in your own mind that could be both defining your leadership, that could be helpful, but maybe also less helpful. And I define change as the disturbance of repeating patterns. Change is the disturbance of repeating patterns. And I know there's loads of research out there that shows that so many change efforts fail. Well, why does that happen? Why is it so hard to change repeating patterns, and we can just get stuck? Now, I'm sure I'm speaking to some very knowledgeable folk here in the room, but I find it fascinating, all the latest progress in the whole field of like neuroscience and neuroimagery, to really look at how the mind actually works and why do we tend to stay with what we know. So we first encounter our experience through, you know, our mammalian brain, the limbic area of our brain, which is the source of all of our emotional reactivity to experience. It's not through the cortical, you know, the higher abstract reasoning. So we first encounter experience through an emotion that then becomes a thought that then actually might, you know, follow through into an action. And there are 8 primary emotions. And this is all sparked by, I'm sure you know about the amygdala, these threat detectors in our brain that are constantly scanning the environment for, do I know this, do I not know this? You know, trying to protect yourself from anything that might be new, scary, and dangerous. That's our biology, isn't it? The fight, flight, fright syndrome. Now, out of those 8 primary emotions, 5 are to do with avoidance of anything new. Fear, anger, disgust, shame, sadness. They're fundamental primary emotions that experience might elicit. And they're all to do with trying to protect ourselves and not actually encounter something new and difficult. So it's not surprising that change is so hard. You know, we are neurologically wired to avoid anything that we might think is threatening or frightening. So how can we escape our biology? How can we escape our biology? And that's where leadership comes in. So what I'm going to be talking about now is this notion of what I call still moving. And it's the subject or the title of my latest book. And the main point here is about the quality of your being, how you are as a leader or your stillness, fundamentally impacts the quality of your doing, what you need to actually do to move the situation around you. Again, somebody on the video said it all starts with your being rather than your knowledge or your doing. So movement and change starts in your stillness as a leader, your own stillness as a leader. And the whole quality of your leadership flows from the quality of your being. I'm sure a lot of you here have a to-do list. I certainly have to-do lists. People have to-do lists. How many of you have a to-be list? You know, to really actually think about how do I need to be in this particular situation. So what I'm going to do now for the rest of the input is to talk through 4 qualities of being, 4 capacities of being that our research, and Michael's been heavily involved with it, fundamentally differentiates leaders who can lead big complex change well to those who cannot lead big complex change well. I won't bore you with all the details around the research methodology. It's written up in my book. But I'll now run through what are these 4 inner capacities, we call them, that allows you to operate from a place of stillness, even if you might be in a situation of high drama, high stress, lots of things happening around you. This is not about going to California for a 2-week yoga retreat. How can you be still in the eye of the storm, which is certainly your profession? So let me start with the capacity to just be in the present moment, to notice and to be absolutely present in the here and now. I'm sure, again, in your profession, if you are doing some complicated surgical procedure or you're with a patient, you know what this means, right? You know what it means to avoid all distraction and be absolutely here right now and not be distracted. And that's called, you know, the attentional network in our minds. The problem is we also have a default network, and the default network in our brains is always associated with remembering, oh my God, what did I do yesterday? Regretting maybe something, or it's occupied all the time with what's going to happen next. You know, Deborah's going on a bit here, you know, what time is she going to go on for? Have I got that train ticket for when I leave at 6:30? You know, so very often we just are not here in the present moment. And of course, the downside of that when you're trying to lead change or movement, let alone when you're with a patient, is that you might miss the only thing that you can change. And the only thing you can change in your life, in your families, in your relationships, at work, is what's here now. You know, the present, the chance to have a risky conversation with somebody, the chance to open up, the chance to address something. The power of now is enormous. So if your brain is somewhere else, and you're not observant in your team meeting or you're just not present, then you miss the chance to bring in the new. By the way, Microsoft have just done some very interesting work on attention spans. And our average attention span now, i.e. how long can we focus on one thing before the mind will wander off to something else, is now only 8 seconds. It's not very long, is it? They do it every 2 years because it's important in their clicking on social media. How long have I got this person before they'll go from WhatsApp to Facebook or whatever? It's very, very important that they actually know this. I think it was 12 seconds 2 years ago. Apparently the average attention span of a goldfish, goodness knows how they work this out, is 9 seconds. So we have now, as a human species, fallen beneath the capacity of a goldfish to be present. So, you know, social media can have lots of advantages. It can also really make us very, very distracted. The other thing about staying present is the capacity to not just be here now and to really tune in with what's going on in yourself or in other people, but to not get thrown by it. And it's called decentering. It's the capacity to know your feelings and your emotional response without them kind of like getting a grip of you. And just notice the difference, for example, between saying, I'm angry, and I feel anger. You know, has the emotion become you, or are you just noticing a temporary state of I feel, you know, sort of anger? It's very, very different to saying I'm angry. You don't define yourself by the emotion. And the moment the brain starts to notice what's going on for you, it actually then changes the emotion. You're in charge of the emotion rather than the emotion being in charge of you. Just a quick story to illustrate this, then I'll move on to the second one, is I was working once with a CEO of a major bank, and she ran the US operation of this bank. And her bank was facing a major SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission inquiry. That's not good news. It was fraud, and it was something that was really, really quite stressful for her. Every morning when she got up, she was the CEO of the bank, she would have her shower in the morning. And you know how sometimes the mirror can get a bit steamed up, you know, when you get out the shower. Sometimes that's good, that you can't actually see yourself. Anyway, what she did every morning was she would actually tune into her emotions, notice what's present for her, and she would draw little emojis on the mirror, on the steam, to enable herself in such a senior position to be able to be in command of her emotions rather than the emotions being in command of her. So staying present, the capacity to notice what's going on for you, but to be able to observe them in a detached way. That's what's meant by staying present. The second inner capacity is about choosing your response to experience. Sometimes I call this, can you hit the pause button between what happens to you and how you respond to what happens to you? There is, we can't always control what happens to us in life. Goodness me, I couldn't control what happened to my poor dad, on Friday night. But we are absolutely in charge of our response to what happens to us. That is absolutely, we have the power and the freedom to choose our response to experience. So how conscious are you in choosing how to be in an experience? And the reason why this is so important is that, again, the brain, are you curious or are you anxious as a leader? Again, as I understand it, the brain can't be both curious and anxious at the same time. So if we instantly respond to something, we're usually our own default or autopilot or defensive routines, our impulsivity will be getting played out, rather than maybe a more creative or resourceful response to what's actually going on. So I find it fascinating that neurochemically we can't be anxious and curious at the same time. I find that absolutely fascinating. So are you in anxiety, or can you choose to be curious and approaching difficulty rather than being anxious about something? So choosing your response and not getting into hyperreactivity. Just a quick story of that. Often when I'm doing leadership group work or change workshops, very often I have large circles, and usually the chairs either side of me are always the two last ones that don't get filled. So you can imagine if I was in kind of reactive mode rather than being more sort of adult and responsive about it, I might think, oh my God, here I go again. My adoption story gets played out. Nobody likes me. Nobody wants to sit next to me, which is dumb, really. But that would be my kind of instinctive reaction to what's going on. Rather than maybe my distance is giving me the necessary space to show leadership here in this meeting and not get worried about it and too anxious or personalized about it. So number one is staying present, being really here right now so that you're with your people, not just with your patients. And second then is the conscious choosing how to be in an experience. And again, apparently the conscious choosing how to be changes the structure of your brain. So that's absolutely fascinating, and we can talk a lot about meditation and how you can actually cultivate these capacities, but they really, really are fundamental. So once you've got this, your ability to tune in and regulate your own inner response to experience, that kind of gives you a clean slate. You're ridding yourself of your own projections and issues and backstories and narratives. And what does that then enable you to do? I'll get now into what I call the systemic capacities. These are about self-management. The next two are all about then how can you tune into and move the system around you. So once you no longer see the world through your own projection or what's happening, you can then be much wiser to tune into what is really going on here. Once you've depersonalized it, what's actually going on? So systemic perception, maybe the metaphor, the analogy in your world is, I'm sure that the body is obviously a system. It is a fundamentally interconnected system. And I'm sure that when you look into one cell of the body, you can detect in that one cell echoes of what's happening elsewhere. Yeah, so no cell is isolated. You might tell me that maybe there is a cell that's isolated. But this whole notion of a systemic issue is when you're investigating one part, and in a sense, it's a fractal of the whole is getting played out in that part. It's exactly the same thing in human systems. So if you are with your team, in the hospital, and there's some stress or disturbance, something is getting played out in your team, it could be, nothing to do about you personally or anything interpersonally about personalities or whatever, but they could be representing something, the wider system that they are bringing into this particular meeting. So rather than get anxious or critical or judging, say, hold on a minute, what's really going on here? Let me look at this systemically rather than in a very, very sort of personal interpretation. And the more you can do that, in fact, out of the 4 inner capacities, this was the one that was most correlated with success in leading complex change. The more you can tune into a deeper system beneath everything, you can then tune into the culture of the place, what the fundamental issues are, and you can get beyond, sort of interpersonal conflict. I worked with a leader once. She was running a big international charity, and they were very, very decentralized, but they were looking to maybe become more like a joined-up charity across all the various countries. And they had a country directors meeting, and the 5 regional directors were doing a Q&A on the stage at the very end. And the country directors were a bit mad. They were saying, you haven't done enough yet as leaders. They were projecting a bit onto the hierarchy. Tell us what to do. We're running out of money. We really need to do something differently here. You should raise your efforts in fundraising, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in the break, for her colleagues who were not seeing this systemically, they were going, oh my goodness, they just don't get it. We should hire different people. It's all of their fault. Or some of them were beating themselves up, saying we should have prepared this better. We're not doing this well enough. But the wise lady, who actually became the CEO eventually of this charity, said, no, there's something systemic happening here. Maybe now is the time. This is a signal. When you're good at systemic perceiving, you read significance into things. Maybe this is now a signal that this is the time where we now have to join up and globalize. So she wasn't taking it personally. She wasn't blaming other people as well. She was seeing a deeper significance behind the event. That's what we mean by perceiving or tuning into the deeper system. And then the very final inner capacity, and this is the one that the ego finds most difficult. I think, actually, all of these are quite challenging to the ego, is what we call the capacity to acknowledge the whole of experience. And boy, that can be very, very hard. So this is a capacity that can fundamentally, almost look back on your life and actually have gratitude for everything that's happened. Can you truly look back and have gratitude for what's happened, and especially the difficult, awkward bits? And can you also be absolutely trusting that whatever happens in the future, will be okay? It's not quite fatalistic, but it is the capacity to look on experience, and particularly difficulty, with respect and with acknowledgement. So my way of doing that to integrate difficulty was, I did not want my dad to have this car accident on Friday night. Goodness me, I didn't. But when we were processing it in the last few days, and he knew I was coming today to do this talk, he said, how fortunate it is that I've had this car accident. I said, really, Dad? He said, because it's given you now such, immediate, just-in-time, first-hand experience of the subject matter that you're going to be talking about. I said, Dad, that's very wise of you, and what an inner capacity he has to actually acknowledge that. And I'm here today because, in a sense, I'm trusting that whatever happens to Dad today and the future will be okay. So the capacity to sit with difficulty and disturbance. Going back to my definition of change is the disturbance of repeating patterns. So if you are leading change, in your institutions, there will be disturbance. And can you give it a positive and respectful place? Because what gets excluded, and we tend to want to exclude difficulty and disturbance, what gets excluded only gets bigger. I'm sure we all know that. If there's a difficult team or a department or an issue, the moment we push it away and exclude it and don't look at it, we might not agree with it, but can you agree to it in some way? Very interesting at the moment, all these geopolitical things and Trump, Brexit, whatever. I might not agree with it all, but at some level, can I agree to what has happened and look for the deeper meaning behind it? The capacity to sit with difficulty. Just a final example on that, and then I'll pull it all together, is, again, I worked with a leader once who was absolutely superlative at this capacity to positively acknowledge everything that is present. Because change flows when difficulty is seen. When difficulty is not seen respectfully, things get stuck. And I'm sure you maybe find that in your own family systems, let alone organizational systems. So this chap, he was called Phil. At the end of he was doing a big restructuring, and I was his change coach, helping him do the restructuring. And at the end of every meeting, he always had 2 flip charts. So, in good sort of, chairing style, on one flip chart, he would write up, so what have I heard? And he would write up decisions and actions, good stuff. Then on the other flip chart, he would write up on the top of the flip chart, what have I not heard in this meeting? And he always allowed about 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the meeting for this. And basically what he was getting to there, what has been present in this meeting but has been too difficult for people to say? And those were always the most productive parts of the meeting, because that gave people, permission to talk about what was difficult and what was disturbing and what was actually troubling. So the capacity to sit with, acknowledge, give due respect to difficulty is a key skill. This was the rarest skill in our research, actually, out of all of these 4. It's a very, very tough one for the ego in particular to look to. But it was particularly present in leaders of large systems who are having to, hold a whole, not be judgmental, not be cynical, not be damaging, but to actually look with wisdom and respect on everything that comes to pass, and somehow give it a narrative and give it meaning. Interesting, I noticed on the door coming in, the subject here was how to lead meaningful change. My book is actually How to Lead Mindful Change, but I thought it was interesting that it's called meaningful change, so the capacity to give meaning to all of experience. Now, I haven't got time today to talk about what you need to do to lead change well, but let me just remind you, it all starts in these 4 inner qualities of being. And if you can master these 4 inner capacities, your leadership will more effortlessly flow and you'll be more inspiring for the folk around you. Again, remembering your task is to work on the system that produces the outcomes when you're leading. So that's all that I'm going to say. I know my time is up, but I know that we have got time for some Q&A. So I think, Peter, you're going to come back and moderate, and Michael. Michael's here for 2 reasons. A, he lives quite close by. He's done a ton of work in the NHS with leadership and change. But I'll be vulnerable here. It was a bit touch and go that I was going to come today, given my emotional state. So I thought, Michael, I'll give you a call on Monday, say,
yes.
Help! Would you mind just being here with me? Because the power of Michael's presence here with me has been very, very good. So thank you for being with me here today, Michael. But over to you now.
Thank you very much. That was brilliant. Come back to that. But we've got time for a few questions. I think we do understand that people have got trains to catch and things, so if you need to slope off, we will understand that. But just to give you a few opportunities, the microphones are here, so you've got to get out your seats and go to the microphones, and I've got to remember to say which one you're on. So, Emma.
Peter, I've got an incentive as well.
Right.
I've got some signed copies of my book here, so we thought whoever asks a question, there's a little incentive. You can come and...
Emma can't read, but... Okay, microphone number 2.
Thank you very much. I really, really enjoyed that, and it really resonated, and thank you for sharing your story. I just wanted to ask a little bit about some of the practicality of, you mentioned and shared kindly the 2 questions that you reach about yourself, about how you respond to change. And I just wondered if you can say a little bit more about how did you go about understanding that about yourself, and what was the process, how much time did you dedicate to that before reaching it?
I think I need to take that question.
I think so.
Sorry.
Although Michael has been with me on my journey, so he probably knows a bit about it. A lot of it, I heard about coaching and mentoring earlier. At 2 or 3 difficult stages in my life, I actually also had psychotherapy, which was enormously helpful at dealing with my patterns. It was largely to do with my inability, sadly, to have my own children, which took me into a bit of a spiral, and sadly a marriage breakup as well. And I wanted to resource myself around, what is it about me? What's my own role in all of this? And can I learn to look on myself with more wisdom and compassion and to understand it? So a lot of it is going to my source. So that, I'm not saying you all have to go to psychotherapy, no way. But I think it's important to go on some inward journey. When we work with leaders, we work with what we call origin stories, to write your origin story. How was your leadership formed? I don't know whether you've ever, done that with a wise coach or a wise mentor. I know, Michael, that you do a lot of that. But it's ongoing. I tell you, my therapist says you always have a pebble in your shoe, you know, when you can't get rid of the pebble. And she says the purpose of that pebble is to keep you awake. So I'll never let go of those two things, but I'm conscious of them now. And when you spot something, you can change something. But it's quite a journey, and it's ongoing. It's certainly not over yet.
Thank you for that.
I don't know whether you want to respond on that at all, Michael.
I would add to that particularly I do a lot of coaching. It's can you try and live in the moment, that experience, so that the learning happens in it. So acknowledging what is there and staying present and healing the relationship, even if that is in a team meeting, is a real way to go rather than avoiding it. So if I can give another example on a slightly bigger note, I was in a workshop just recently whereby a question was asked about whistleblowing and people not being able to say things, and a question was raised. What was interesting in that room was nobody even wanted to have the conversation. What was even more interesting, the person moderating that session didn't even notice that that had happened. Whereas I was sitting there kind of thinking, well, what is going on in the room whereby there's a question which is now being ignored at multiple levels, and what would it take for us to recognize this as a pattern which we need and want to dive into in that very moment?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Microphone one.
I would like to know what your views are in terms of considering religion and culture within this sort of framework, and whether any work has been done. Because I think religious and cultural values give a very different connotation in terms of how you perceive and view some of these concepts, which are obviously fascinating.
Yeah.
But I guess religion and culture can have a very strong and powerful influence on how you develop these things.
Yes. Oh, how to unpick that in 3 minutes?
While you're unpicking it, can I just say we've got three more people, I think, to ask questions. If we can keep them really brief and no more after that, if you wouldn't mind.
Did you say religion and culture?
That's right.
I notice I struggle with the word culture in the abstract, because I think culture is simply something which would make explicit things which define us as individuals within the room and the human condition. And the question is, can we create the space to have all of that named and acknowledged, no matter how difficult that is? I'll give you an example. At the moment, I'm working in Belgium, where the predominant culture is devoutly practical Roman Catholic, and that pervades the whole culture in terms of doing things right and being modest, such that when we get things wrong, we don't even talk about it. So that's one particular example. Deborah and I have both worked in multinational organizations, and I speak as I find. I think there's a lot of people who find it very difficult to name the thing that is obvious in the room. And how do we create conditions where it is absolutely legitimate to say, part of my leadership stems from my faith and my religious practice. And that needs to have a space. I don't know, Deborah, what you would do.
No, just a quick one. I tend to try and stay away from the spiritual when I'm working with leaders in business settings, because everybody has their own, sort of way of looking at this. But often when we do this work, it does go into a more spiritual dimension. And I think leadership is that, actually, to be honest with you, to be frank. I'm going to China next week, and a big story about how I'm learning to work in the Chinese culture, but we haven't got time now. But it's a fantastic question, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Number 3.
Hi, I've just a short question around, as a leader, how do you actually balance the understanding where you're coming from and how that's led to your current leadership and the staying in the present and actually working on what you do now?
Often who you are is the compass by which you decide how you are going to show up in that particular situation. So if in the team environment in which you're working, or a clinical group or whatever, you do need to choose what is the next smallest step that you can make which will cause a disturbance which people can handle, rather than a disturbance which will cause people to reject it, and a bit like an immune response. And you might also do something which is very traditional, or untraditional, is say to people, this is what I'm noticing and this is what I might like to try in this group, and I'm going to ask for help to do it. Just as you would if you were doing an elective procedure on somebody you didn't quite know, you would ask your body to help you do it right and learn from it.
I love that idea of actually in the moment say, I'm noticing my leadership, we're going to take a risk here. Having meeting observers, I don't know whether you guys do that, but I often find that having observers, having one of you to say, right, and rotate it. So, you know, every other meeting, you actually have somebody come in and observe what's actually going on in the here and now. So rapid feedback loops, I think, is so vital. It often happens after the meeting, in the corridor, through bilaterals, rather than working in the moment. The capacity to be in the moment and to notice what's happening in the moment and change what's happening in the moment. You know, this is what this skill is all about. Then you'll get quicker change in the organisation, not that repeating sort of firefighting.
Thank you. These questions are beautifully succinct. Can we keep the trend? Number 2.
Maybe our responses aren't.
Really interesting presentation. There's an irony that one of the things I think I'll do is write a to-be list. I think that's a really memorable phrase.
Yeah.
One thing that really strikes me hearing your story and the story of the Afghan refugee we saw yesterday was that a lot of great qualities are forged in adversity. But it also strikes me that you have a decision to make at that point whether you treat it as a challenge or a threat. How do we get, or as medical leaders, how do we encourage our teams, our trainees to react to adversity with curiosity rather than contempt?
Wonderful. Can I take that straight? I have stock questions in my back pocket, and when I was doing a big restructuring of the BBC, I needed a lot of these questions. But one question I used a lot that was so helpful was, in some way, why was that meant to happen? You know, we'd have like a bus stop, or the public service of the BBC would say, no, you can't send Jeremy Clarkson to Mexico, he's going to say something wrong, and we'll pull top gear, and you know, very, very stressful sort of situations. And people would often try and find the blame. My stance as a leader, and I was the Worldwide People Director, was always to say, stop the judgment, stop the fear, because fear drives out freedom to be more creative and curious, and to actually say, in some way, how has this experience been a resource to us, even though it is the most horrible or difficult or damaging thing? And I just love that capacity to ask the question, in some way, how has this experience, even its difficulty, been a resource to us? And can I just stay with this gentleman? So what I forgot to do was I did this Twitter poll. I think some of you might have done it before the conference, as to which one of these 4 most had resonance with you guys. Look at that. So almost half of the people who did this Twitter poll felt that particular capacity for your profession right now was the one that most needed attention. So, you know, I thank you for asking that question. Again, come up at the end if you've got some time, but that capacity to positively connote, not sugarcoating, it is not sugarcoating, but it's talking about, in some way, why was that helpful to us? In struggle, we learn. When we're comfortable, we don't learn. We always learn from discomfort, sadly. I wish we could learn from comfort. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Last word, number 1.
Hi, thinking about the title, Leading Mindful Change, I was wondering if you think that having a personal mindfulness practice is of value.
I've got one here, actually.
Yes, I would say...
Mindful everything, aren't you?
So I'm a mindful runner. And what that means is when you're in a 50-year-old body, you think you can't compete with somebody who's 26. But there is something about, not only is it for me of value, it is essential to establishing what are all the kind of bubbles and things going on in me, and what is my stuff, what is of the system, and how do I work that in a way to generate awareness such that we have choice so we can move somewhere different. So as a human, I think the greatest thing I bring to my presence is being fully and authentically me, and accepting fully who you are in how you are at that particular time without any desire to change it. And mindfulness for me, and others will have practices, that enables me to do that. So conscious, focused, present, without trying to change it.
I know that some of you might have done mindfulness training as well. I know it's being brought into the healthcare system big time, but all of the successful leaders in our study had some kind of daily mindfulness practice. Daily. And I'm sure the theory, you guys know this, that it takes at least 8 to 10 minutes every day of mindful practice to change the brain structure. Okay. It is daily. It's not, oh, it's Saturday morning now, I'll go and do yoga. You know, it is daily inward reflection. Some people do doodling, mindful walks outdoors. I mean, you don't just have to sit and sort of meditate, but do if you want to pick up the book, but it's daily practice. That's what changes brain structures. And that's when mindfulness becomes a trait rather than a state. A trait means it's a permanent state of being mindful, and you only get to that level if you do something every day. Journaling, I love journaling. I do a lot of journaling every day. That's another practical thing to do.
Thank you.
So I think we were allowed until latest 5:10, and it's now 17:09:53. So.
Yeah, there's a big red sign here saying time is up. So can I just say thank you both very much indeed. You sort of brought us full circle.